Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. As mentioned, I work for the Japanese American National Museum doing public programs. And on behalf of the museum, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Really important discussion and topic. We're really excited to be partnering with not only UPenn, but also all of the other folks who are on this call, and really grateful for the opportunity to kind of expand beyond just that in this time of COVID time, we're able to expand beyond just Little Tokyo and have these national conversations with other organizations and groups and individuals who are thinking about and reflecting on similar ideas. I want to say that this is, for us, part of our JANM at Home initiative. Unfortunately, we can't be welcoming people into our building and our home in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles, but we're really excited to be able to do virtual programming like this. And that includes different discussions and webinars, and as well as educational resources. You'll be hearing more from our education department later today, and other exciting offerings. So definitely encourage folks to check that out on our website, janm.org. That's jann.org. And just really excited to be able to just have this conversation today and welcome you all. This is just really important to the museum to be talking about solidarity and all of the themes that are reflected in this film. So thank you so much. And with that, I want to pass along to Scott Moore, who's the director of Penn Global China Program.
Thanks very much, Joy. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon, this evening, or whatever the time is where you happen to be. I am part of the provost office at Penn, something called the Global Initiatives team that works on some of our international affairs and global engagement activities. I wanted to say just a little bit about Penn's task force on providing support to Asian and Asian American students and scholars. It's a bit of a long name. We usually refer to it just as the task force, and that's one of the sponsors for the event. I'm part of the task force along with several of the others who you see on your screen here. And that task force was established this spring really as an outgrowth of the spike in anti-Asian incidents that we started to become aware of in Philadelphia, in our Penn campus community, and around the nation and around the world. And it was set up at the behest of our provost, Wendell Pritchett, who was personally very concerned by this issue. And we wanted to do what we could to marshal university resources to try to address that issue, as well as to tap into the intellectual resources that we have at the university and in our wider community to raise awareness about this issue and this very unfortunate outgrowth of the pandemic in terms of increases in discrimination, bias, and violence against people of Asian background. So one of the ways that we try to do that is through an event series, and this event is part of that series. As with many series and events, it's thanks to a lot of people that were able to join you and gather us all this evening. And so I just want to thank all the members of the task force, our task force co-chairs, the Associate Vice Provost for Global Initiatives at Penn, Amy Gadsden, as well as the Executive Director and Chief of Staff for the Division of Public Safety, Kathleen Shields Anderson, the Program in Asian American Studies at Penn, Penn Libraries, as well as the Pan Asian American Community House at Penn. I also wanted to especially thank our event partners and the Japanese American National Museum. As Joy mentioned, one of the upsides of the pandemic period is that we kind of are presented with these new opportunities to develop new partnerships and collaborations. And I think that's particularly important and exciting for the work of our task force, because we realize, first of all, that the problem that we're trying to confront is certainly not confined to our local region. And moreover, the members of our community who are being impacted by it are around the country and around the world. And so developing partnerships with entities and organizations around the country, and perhaps even at some point around the world, will, I think, help us do our work better, and will certainly enrich it. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Peter.
Thanks, Scott. Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Van Doe. I serve as the director for the Pan Asian American Community House, otherwise known as PATCH at UPenn, an Asian American cultural resource center and hub for undergraduate, graduate, and professional students with ties to faculty and staff, alumni, and the local community here in Philadelphia. I also serve as a lecturer for the Penn Asian American Studies program as well. Pretty much Scott and I are the co-chairs for the task force program series, so we want to officially welcome you all for today's event. This program series is called pretty much is called Stopping the Hate and Starting to Heal, Living with and Through the COVID-19 Pandemic. And I invite all of you to check our website for future programs and participate in the future programs that will happen since this June and until whenever we get through this, ultimately through COVID-19. But we have some programs already set up, and I'm going to send a link over through the chat. Furthermore, I also want to say that from my end, I want to say that Black Lives Matter, ultimately, and that anti-Asian violence is made possible with and due to anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous sentiment. And I want to say that firmly because this is something that is all interrelated, and certainly, you know, we might touch upon anti-Blackness within the Asian American community within our discussion as well. But these are certainly important conversations, and certainly I think it's really important to connect the Japanese American internment situation and also Islamophobia. One of the things I also want to sort of highlight is the spectrum of disrespect towards Asian communities and its impact. So I'll give you some examples. From the smaller scale, there's the assumption that Asian Americans are not born here. There might be staring, distancing oneself away from Asian Americans more than others, assuming Asian Americans have the coronavirus or have been exposed to it, microaggressions. On a more higher level, it could be shaming, humiliation, often in the form of jokes, using or defending the use of the term Chinese virus, China virus, Wuhan virus, or Kung flu, not patronizing Asian American owned businesses, and calling the COVID-19 hotlines to complain about Asian Americans. And the more severe cases would maybe include verbal harassment, including slurs, telling people to go back where you came from, or speaking to people in fake Chinese, bullying, online harassment, including rape or death threats, anti-Asian and Asian American graffiti or memes, spitting, or sexual or physical assaults. And so the impacts will be, you know, on a spectrum from psychological and mental health, social and financial, community, and certainly, you know, in some cases within our own country's history, there's policy. I want to give gratitude to the panelists and to our moderator. We've prepped our panelists to speak openly and honestly and with an open heart and not to hold back anything. We really want to have a true dialogue, and hopefully this will be a great example for all the participants here to have their dialogues, their own dialogues within their own respective spaces. With this said, I want to introduce Mohammed Samras. He's our student moderator.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mohammed. I'm a rising senior at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm studying health and societies, and you know, I've been involved with the Pan Asian American Community House on campus in a bunch of different capacities. So I'm excited to see where this discussion series goes and kind of the work we can do to create a healthier Penn and a healthier world ultimately. So just some logistics going into our discussion here. So we will be starting off with a facilitated discussion that where I'll be pushing questions to the panelists, and so we'll talk about that for a little bit. After that, we'll have a Q&A portion, which will be the bulk of this program. So if you'll look towards the bottom of your screen, you'll have the ability to submit questions for Q&A. We'll try to get to as many as we can And you also, as Brian mentioned, have the ability to upvote any kinds of questions that you may really want to see discussed. We also just ask that you please be respectful. Please do not be disrespectful towards anybody. This is a safe space. So if you are being disruptive to the panelists, to other members of the audience, you will be removed. So please just move forward in the most respectful way possible. And so before I introduce the panelists, I just wanted to echo what Peter said at the beginning about the importance of these conversations now and how interconnected our identities really are. They're not as separate as the people in power may like to make them seem. Ultimately, we are fighting very similar fights. So in the pursuit of that healthier world, I think this is a really important discussion, and I hope that this gives you some food for thought that you'll take beyond just the next hour and a half. I will tell you, as a Muslim named Muhammad who grew up in New York, that a lot of these conversations don't happen nearly as much as they need to happen. So I hope that there's something for everybody to take away from this. And yeah, without further ado, I'll introduce the panelists. So first up, we have the filmmaker and the director of our film at hand, Akira Bach, who is an Emmy-winning filmmaker and the director of the Watase Media Arts Center at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. He has an MFA in directing from the UCLA School of Film, TV, and Digital Media, and has made over 50 short films, documentaries, and music videos. Next up, we have Rob Busher, who is a film and media specialist, educator, and published author who also lectures at the Penn Asian American Studies program. As a person of biracial Japanese American heritage who is deeply involved in his community, Rob serves as the president of the Philadelphia chapter of civil rights group, Japanese American Citizens League, and he chairs the editorial board of Pacific Citizen, or CJACL's national newspaper. Next, I'd like to introduce Yazmin Zaza, pronouns they, them, theirs, who is an Arab American organizer and the current organizer at Vigilant Love. They hold an MA in Women's/Gender Studies, and their research focuses on the rhetorical analysis of surveillance, counterinsurgency programs like countering violent extremism. Our final panelist is Sohaila Pagano, pronouns she, her, hers, who is the education specialist at the Japanese American National Museum, or JANM, where she develops educational experiences and resources for K-12 students and educators, and also oversees the museum's volunteer docents and facilitators. Sohaila holds a master's degree in art education, which is with a specialization in museum education and administration from The Ohio State University, and bachelor's in art history and architecture from Penn State University. So welcome all of our panelists and welcome to the audience. And so we can just get started. So my first question here is for Akira, who is the director of our film. And so we kind of just want to get into the process of producing this documentary. So the first question that I had was, what were the reasons why you produced this documentary? And after that, you can kind of go into why you think it's important to know the history.
Okay, thanks, Mo. First of all, I just want to thank everyone for attending this. I also want to thank the UPenn Asian American Studies Program, Studies Center, for putting this all together. I think it's really incredible that you're providing this historical context to this current moment that we're facing in terms of anti-Asian bias in the US. So a little bit of background about the film. I hope you guys have watched it already. It's on YouTube. If you haven't, please do that right after it. Again, it's called 9066 to 9/11. It was produced by the Watase Media Arts Center at the Japanese American National Museum. And we released it in 2004, but we actually started production around beginning of 2002. It was a team effort. I am just here representing that team. It was executive produced by Karen Ishizuka and Bob Nakamura, who are a couple of longtime, very esteemed Asian American filmmakers. I was very lucky to be able to work on this project with them. So as I mentioned, it was shot between 2002 and 2003, and we completed it around spring or so of 2004. And that was a long time ago. right? That was about 16 years ago. So things were a lot different back then. So I just want to remind everyone that 9/11 had happened in 2001, and that was followed by Bush and Cheney's war in Afghanistan, which was then followed by the war in Iraq. So this was essentially the beginning of their endless war on terror, which is still going on today, right? I think a lot of people have kind of forgotten that just back in, I believe, January of this year, the United States government killed one of Iran's military leaders, which is a continuation of this endless war. And if not for COVID, who knows what would have happened with that entire situation. But I digress. So after 9/11 occurred, there were a lot of people in the Japanese American community that started to notice a lot of similarities between what happened to the Japanese Americans post Pearl Harbor, post the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, and the post 9/11 treatment of Muslims and Arab Americans. And it seemed like history was starting to repeat itself, right? So there were countless hate crimes being committed. There was the government detainment of Muslims and Arab Americans, in particular males. And essentially the idea of equality under the rule of law was being ignored, and people were losing their civil rights. So we decided to make a film that drew the parallels between the two experiences. And I personally felt like it was an opportunity to use Japanese American history to point out that the US government was starting to make similar mistakes, and they were starting to traumatize innocent people. And ultimately, I wanted to, in our own small way, warn against the blanket systemic racism that was being aimed at Muslims and Arab Americans. So in making this film, we really wanted to personalize the experience of the Muslim and Arab American community. And one of the biggest challenges that we had was actually getting people to talk on camera, in particular, those that were detained. And that's why we only had one person that was willing to talk during that whole time period. And that was Abed Taba. And obviously, if you've seen the film, he's well represented in it. And he basically allowed us to put a human face on the discrimination that was being faced. And I think that the main reason that nobody wanted to talk was fear, right? Fear, in particular, fear of deportation, because the Bush and Cheney administration were acting really aggressively towards these groups of people. We also wanted to counterbalance the mainstream media's portrayal of Muslims and Arabs, right? Because after 9/11, the news media, TV shows, and movies were doing a terrible job of covering and portraying Muslims and Arabs. And they were just putting out the worst stereotypes that you can imagine. And I believe that there were government agencies even working with Hollywood studios to concoct storylines. We didn't have Rami back then, right? There was no sort of multi-dimensional portrayals of Arab Americans and Muslims. And lastly, I think that the other goal that we wanted to achieve was to spread the message that concentration camps in America should never happen again. And some people may think, well, that's just crazy. That would never happen anyways. But at the time, the idea was being floated out there by various right-wing officials and pundits, right? They're out there spreading that message through the mainstream media. And ultimately, we know that an entire ethnic group or religious group wasn't incarcerated, but detaining several thousand people is nothing to sniff at.
Yeah, thank you so much, Akira. I think you touched on a lot of really, really salient points and issues that, they're not just limited to the historical moment they take place in. They affect us today, years and years after they happen. So thank you for bringing attention to that, and thank you for being a part of making this wonderful film. My next question is for Yazin on building community and community activism. So Yazin, if you could speak more towards just what Islamophobia looks like in America, because there's not just one form of how it's seen or how it's felt. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Muhammad. And also wanting to echo Akira with thanks to UPenn and Janum for organizing this. We were really excited as Vigilant Left to participate. But in terms of Islamophobia, I think something that Peter mentioned before we broke off into this panel was all the different ways that violence manifests itself. So he was referencing anti-Asian violence, but the different things that he was talking about were things like physical violence, right? Hate crimes, things that are maybe more personalized, but also a lot of structural violence that's taking place, and also referencing severity, right? So like this idea of jokes, or this idea of comments that are made in passing, or maybe things that are never even said but are communicated in a look, and then escalating all the way into really, really violent acts between people. So a person enacting violence against someone else, or a structure, right, enacting violence against an entire community and creating structures that impact whole communities. And I think with what Akira was talking about, these kinds of distinctions are important in really understanding that you can't define a type of violence in one way, right? Asking what does Islamophobia look like is like asking what does racism look like, right? There's just so many different ways to encapsulate it. And I think something else that Peter had touched on was all the different ways that other types of racism and violences work together to create a specific type of violence, right? So if we're talking about Islamophobia, there's a lot of anti-Black racism that goes into creating context of Islamophobia, right? The two often work together and fuel each other. If we're talking about, for example, East African Muslim migrants in the United States, or if we're talking about African American Muslim communities in the US, there's a really specific type of targeting that police and other federal bodies use when they're surveilling these communities, or when they're enacting violence, right? Or if we're talking about communities who are impacted by war, it's the United States that's bombing Iraq and Syria, right? And that's how you get Syrian and Iraqi refugees here who are Muslim migrants, who also experience a lot of Islamophobia, but have experienced war and are also currently experiencing a lot of xenophobia, don't have documentation, are working under the table, right? Like these kinds of things. So I think when we're thinking about what Islamophobia looks like, a lot of times people will think of it in this very, very specific way of like, oh, it's this anti-Muslim bias. But we have to think, okay, what does that mean if you amplify it on a structural level? What does that mean when a country signs war based on their Islamophobic politics, right, and their Islamophobic agenda? How does this relate to Zionism? How is Israel's Islamophobia tied into the colonization of Palestine, right? So really thinking about Islamophobia as a lens that allows countries, that allows politicians, that allows structures to enact certain types of violence, and those violences working together with anti-Black racism, with Zionism, with xenophobia, and this is without even getting into class, right? So I think something else that's really important, so Vigilant Love, for folks who don't know, we're considered a solidarity organization between the Japanese American community and the Muslim American community. And we originated out of this similar moment that Akira's referencing, right? This awareness that there's a relationship between what started happening on a structural level after 9/11 and what happened to the Japanese and Japanese American community. And what happened and continues to happen to the Japanese and Japanese American community isn't just one executive order, right? Incarceration didn't come out of nowhere. It's something that was heavily tied to immigration policies, labor policies, and exploitation, right? A lot of encouraged vigilante violence, a lot of structures that prioritize white American middle class and upper middle class men over other communities. So thinking about 9/11 is not a moment where all of a sudden Islamophobia emerged, right? You have a lot of Zionism and a lot of Islamophobia fueling a lot of US foreign policy all the way from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? You're thinking of Iran, you're thinking of Palestine. So these caricatures that we're talking about in media, those start to become much more commonplace, I think, in certain ways after 9/11. But 9/11 is in no way the moment where all of a sudden this happened. I think instead, if we think of 9/11 as a moment where the next phase of the structural Islamophobia violence or Islamophobic violence, that's how we can maybe think of Islamophobia, right? This creation of the war on terror that is limitless, that is now domestic, that is transnational, and doesn't necessarily tie to one country anymore, right? If we think of a Muslim, they are the enemy, right, in the war on terror, or someone who looks like a Muslim. So really thinking of 9/11 as this moment that normalized this idea that Islam is a pervasive threat anywhere at any time. I think too, this isn't even getting into the ways that gender intersects, right? I'm thinking about the very specific ways that different Muslim community members will experience Islamophobia based on their race, based on their gender, based on their documentation status. So for us at Vigilant Love, I think attaching the nuance to Islamophobia is really important in being able to pinpoint where the violence is going.
Thank you, Yasmin. That was very well said. And I love that you bring attention to how, discrimination and oppression occurs on a bunch of different axes that have different intersections at differing capacities. So we have to be aware of all that moving forward. And I really, echo a lot of what you said, just having the experience of a Muslim American, after 9/11, especially being in New York and seeing the kind of changes that took place, but also the kind of things that didn't really change. They just kind of were louder and weren't as quiet and insidious as they were before. So really quickly, I wanted to build upon that first question for you and just ask what specific ways individuals can take action or get involved with this type of community activism.
Definitely. So at Vigilant Love, we have a couple of different campaigns going. For folks who aren't familiar with a program called Countering Violent Extremism, I don't have time right now, I know, to go into explaining it. But in short, it's a surveillance program that works through nonprofit servicing and schools and universities. So one of our campaigns is specifically working with students on different university campuses to research how that university is being granted money to enact that specific surveillance program. So folks who are students or who are affiliated with universities, we encourage you to plug in with us to expand that research. We have a coalition in partnership with other organizations like Stop LAPD Spying, Muslim Student Association West, and also collaborating with the Palestinian Youth Movement. And then one other campaign we have right now is called Service is Not Surveillance, and it's specifically building with service providers and mental health professionals and community members to understand how does the surveillance program that I'm referencing, Countering Violent Extremism, work with service providers to monitor the therapy room? And how can therapists who don't want to work in this field or work in this way to surveil their patients, how can they be activated to take a stand and support their community members? And lastly, how can community members learn about what might happen in the therapy room and what rights do they have to resist being surveilled? What rights do they have to demand of their therapist in terms of what's disclosed and what's not? And what rights don't they have under national security laws? So for folks interested in learning about either of those campaigns, about our work in general, we love connecting with folks. But again, super grateful to be here.
Thank you so much. And for all of our audience members, if you want to learn more about Vigilant Love, you can take a look at the chat. Joy has been kind enough to leave a link there. So definitely check that out if that's something that you're interested in. So moving on, I know Yasmin talked about all these different intersections, and I think they're especially relevant to Penn's campus and the larger Penn community in Philadelphia. I know in my experience as a student, there's been a lot of intersecting identities that affect different communities at different levels. So when it comes to getting involved with your local community, luckily we have Rob, who is not only a lecturer at Penn, but also is involved with the Philly community. So the next question is for you, Robin. How you think that individuals, especially within the Asian American Pacific Islander community, can build community during this time?
Thank you so much, Mo, for that question. And I think, to think about it from this moment, it's a very special time that we're in terms of the COVID circumstances. It's not like we can go out to community town halls or engage with people in community hubs like Chinatown or some of the Southeast Asian business areas that we might normally be able to do. But at the same time, we have these ways of interacting with each other, which we're seeing right now, right? I mean, in a sense, we're building community here together. But I think that to simplify it as, you know, what we can do in this moment needs to step back and look at how we build coalitions in the first place. Coalition building is not something that takes place overnight. It really does require years of relationship building. And I think earnest want to do the work, not to have your name on something, but to really be there showing up, not just for your community, but for other communities that are being impacted by things. And, you know, looking at how the Japanese American community has functioned over the last really 32 years since the redress movement ended. That was sort of our big civil rights push, right? When we were fighting for an apology from the US government for the incarceration of our communities during World War II. And I think for some people, when that was over, they felt that their activism could be over, right? But I think a far greater number of Japanese Americans understood that there were other communities, both Asian American and outside of the Asian American community, that could really benefit from our mutual advocacy around a variety of different issues. And that has led to coalition building on a number of fronts, including combating Islamophobia, including combating anti-Blackness. I think particular to this conversation, from myself as a biracial Japanese American, my political awakening happened when 9/11 happened, because I was a freshman in high school. And I realized in that moment that this is probably what my oba-chan, my grandmother, went through after December 7th, 1941. And I think it was a powerful moment to start looking around and seeing how hate was seeping into our own community in rural suburban Connecticut. Within a week of the 9/11 attacks, our only Sikh-owned business in our town was attacked with a hate crime. And, you know, witnessing that firsthand kind of helped me to understand, again, how interconnected these movements are, and how interconnected we as communities must be to kind of stand up and be allies for each other in our moments of weakness. In the Philadelphia context, the Japanese American community has been deeply engaged with the Muslim American community basically since 9/11. So when we're talking about building coalition, you know, this is a 2-decade endeavor that's based on now 2 generations or more of community members, community leaders, and just really showing up and working together on issues. You know, as early on as 2001, there were obviously a spike of hate crimes. Japanese American leadership at the time was very responsive in trying to help the Muslim and Arab American communities, as well as the Sikh and South Asian communities who are perceived as Muslim, to kind of navigate the situation that they then found themselves in. And unfortunately, in the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen a spike again in this kind of Islamophobic hate here in Philadelphia. I think the SEPTA bus ad campaign in 2014 is a perfect example of this, in which a Islamophobic campaign really targeted with some erroneous information about the Muslim community. 2015, immediately after the Trump campaign speech related to the Muslim travel ban, Al-Aqsa, the mosque in Northeast Philly, was vandalized with a severed pig's head. And in that moment, the Japanese American community came together with dozens of other allied communities to host a community picnic with the Muslim community there in Northeast Philly. And from those kinds of relationships, we were able to continue building in sort of an effort to educate the public while also delving into the history of racism and, I guess, the shared narratives of propaganda and anti-Asian and anti-Muslim propaganda that has persisted in film and television, and as well as popular media and journalism. So we've been hosting exhibits as the Japanese American Citizens League basically since 2016 with the Muslim American community that tries to focus that energy and really understand what about our experiences are similar. Most recently, we have hosted an exhibit called American Peril, which traces the history of anti-Asian racism through racialized propaganda artifacts. And we actually were able to showcase that at Philadelphia City Hall, featuring about 20 portraits of Muslim American and Japanese American community members who have been directly impacted by anti-Asian and anti-Muslim rhetoric. So, you know, at the end of the day, I think we need to look at how we can build coalitions, not only within our own community, but really how we can bring in others like us, right? And obviously, Japanese Americans are a very small community in Philadelphia, about 3,000 in total. So thinking of how we can relate not just to Islamophobia, but other issues like immigrant detention camps. The Japanese American incarceration is a parallel to that, but so is the Chinese detention at Angel Island Immigration Station, and so is Southeast Asian refugee camps. So I think, you know, initially the work kind of starts there, but as people get involved, that transcends beyond their own lived experience as they become stakeholders in a movement to demand justice for communities that are on the front line currently. So, you know, that's sort of been my approach and the Japanese American community's approach in blending activism and education in the public sphere.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I think, you know, just like when you list off all the examples of the different kinds of events that have happened to all of the different communities that you mentioned, I mean, you know, the word I keep saying is different because our community is so incredibly diverse, and it can get confusing when figuring out where to start and, you know, how to address any kind of apathy or inaction and go in a route that's more engaging with the public. So I really appreciated your comments on that, and also kudos to all the organizations that you all work with, but also in the coalition building that happens, because I think that really is where we see all that wonderful growth. So I guess kind of along the same vein of engaging, I wanted to ask Sohaila about storytelling and its relevance to the youth. So Sohaila, if you could talk a little bit about the role that storytelling has in engaging youth with both the historic and contemporary manifestations of racism and discrimination.
Of course, thank you so much, Mo. And I'll echo what everyone else has said. I'm really thankful to be part of this group today, and thankful to, as an educator, be asked to be part of a panel. And because working, you know, with kids is what I do at the museum. And one of the things that we do offer for our middle and high school students is to screen this film and have a discussion with them about it. So yeah, at JANM, one of our main objectives when we have students on site is to help them make personal and human connections to and with the content that we're talking about, meaning that we want them to connect with the lived experiences of others, but then also connect history to their own lived experiences. So sort of like this windows and mirrors, analogy. If you've heard that before, it's, you know, opening a window into something maybe you haven't heard of before, or something that's new. So a lot of students, not having heard about Japanese American incarceration. A lot of our students now also not having lived through 9/11, that being before their time. So like opening these windows, but then also having mirrors where they can see themselves and they can see their own identities validated within the stories that we're telling. So for us, storytelling and like the personal lived experiences is a really key sort of pedagogical tool that we use when we're teaching students. And it's our job then as educators to help make the connections between the lived experiences of individuals, either through like their testimony, may it be like an oral history, or we're really fortunate to have volunteer docents and facilitators who like lead programs who share their own lived experiences or their family experiences. So we connect in those ways. And then also, of course, as a museum, the stories that are embedded within the collections that we hold. So we use all of these stories to help students learn about the lives of others, as well as make connections with their own lives. And it's our job to help them make those connections.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sohaila. And so I guess kind of moving, towards focusing more on history. Why even teach the history, and what relevance do you think it really holds for the youth of today? Do you think that kind of engagement is easy with how accessible current events are to youth today, or do you think that maybe getting desensitized to it also plays a role in where history factors into the relevance for younger people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, Akira mentioned this as well, like in making the film, wanting to share the stories, the idea so that this never happens again, right? And so when we're sharing these stories and when we talk about history, we can say, is what is happening now, is it similar to what had happened in the past? In what ways, how, and what can we do about it? And one of our volunteers said this to me once that really, it stuck with me. They said, it's not so that history doesn't repeat itself, because we know that history is going to repeat itself. And I think, unfortunately, we're seeing that history is repeating itself. It's that so when history does repeat itself, that we know that it's happening and that we can fight. And so I think understanding the history and making the connections between past and present are really critical when we're talking about activism, when we're talking about solidarity, when we're talking about justice and democracy and all of those things. Understanding where we've come from, I think, is like really important tool in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sohaila, for talking about your experiences and kind of where we can move forward. So that concludes the formalized panel part of this program. So we can start moving into the Q&A section. Just a reminder, I know Joy's also mentioned in the chat that you could submit any questions that you'd like discussed by the panelists. And so we'll keep on sending those in, and we'll start getting to a couple of those questions. I also just wanted to thank the panelists once again for offering your insight on all those questions. I think everything you said is really, really important to be hearing and discussing today, so thank you. Okay, so I'm looking through our Q&A. And I think I'd like to start off with this question, which was submitted anonymously. They said the film showed Japanese individuals who noted that the day after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, they could feel people staring at them in aggressive ways. I'm wondering what the experience of discrimination was for Japanese people before the bombing. And similarly, what about Muslims in 9/11? By the way, excellent film. So that's for any of the panelists to chime in on.
I can jump in really quick to say sort of how we talk about that with students. We do try to, I guess, front load the learning to say that, December 7th, 1941 was a really important date, but Japanese Americans were already living in a climate of fear and racism towards them at that time anyway. And so in building up towards talking about the World War II incarceration, we talked to them about, like the land laws that were in place. Immigrants from Japan not being able to own land in several states, including California. There being pretty much a halt on immigration of anyone from Japan in 1924. So there, what already was, it didn't start again, sort of like Yazan was saying with 9/11. That's not the start of Islamophobia, and that wasn't the start of anti-Japanese sentiment. It just put the exclamation point on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Akira, I was wondering if you had anything to add, being the filmmaker.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just add that yes, there was definitely that systemic racism that was aimed at the Japanese and Japanese American community. And from the research that I've done, it seems that the Japanese immigrants, the Issei, the first generation, were much more aware of that kind of discrimination, and that their children, the Nisei, the second generation, they really felt like they were American, right? They believed that they were American. they probably experienced, could only assume that they experienced a lot of casual racism, like, you know, on an occasional basis. But once the executive order came down and everyone was forced to leave the West Coast, they were sort of in disbelief because they were born here and they felt that they had the rights of an American citizen, which just turned out not to be true.
Sorry, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Akira, for sharing. So for our next question, which was also submitted anonymously, they said, "Thank you for sharing the film. It's very thought-provoking. I'm an Asian American who was raised in America, and I distinctly remember in middle school, a few years post 9/11, that my white female history teacher insisted to the class that Islam was, quote unquote, an inherently violent religion. Though I felt skeptical of her assertion, I imagine others may have believed her, and that may have helped shape her discriminatory or prejudicial thoughts/behavior towards Muslims. What can we do to decouple this harmful rhetoric that is being put forth even in our schools? Thank you all for being here."
There's actually a great spoken word artist. I'll link her to the chat, or maybe someone from the panel like coordinating can send that. But there's a lot of work that people are doing around, and this is from Heart Women and Girls, Justice for Muslims Collective, and a few other people in the US on gendered Islamophobia. And one of the things they really look at is the sort of really like exceptional ways that what's considered violence against women is portrayed when it happens to Muslim women. So the spoken word artist that I'm referencing, the reason I'm referencing her is because if we're thinking about a useful tool for youth or in an education setting, she does a really simple thing of breaking down why do we call an honor killing something different than domestic violence, for example? Or why do we understand certain types of traditions as extremely or inherently violent because they're Muslim, instead of tying them to this larger issue of patriarchy as something that condones or creates violence against women. And I think really learning to not exceptionalize and not fetishize, or really not like taking away this really Orientalist understanding of Islam is really important. So on the one hand, I think demystifying Islam, understanding that there are a lot of ways that religious texts exist, and that there are a lot of complexities that other communities are allowed that Muslims are not, right? Thinking about how racism plays into that and these things. And on the other side, just really quickly thinking about who it benefits to understand Islam a certain way. Like, why is the United States so bent on having us understand Islam in a specific way in this moment? And if we think of Afghanistan, a lot of times, a lot of children are taught we're going to Afghanistan to liberate Afghan women, right? But what's not discussed is the role that the United States played in funding the groups that became the Taliban when it suited them, right? And so I think looking at who stands to benefit from certain portrayals of communities, and also how those portrayals are really, really skewed for a specific way. And so again, I'll send the names of the orgs and that spoken word artist as an educational tool, because I think it's great for youth specifically to be able to engage.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. I totally echo a lot of just the impact that those kind of perceptions can have. I remember just growing up and having my own kind of understanding of terrorism get shaped by media and by what people were talking about around me, which was really interesting because, it's like my own faith that I'm growing up with is being presented in a totally different way. So I think, there's a lot that the classroom has in addressing that. And so hopefully we'll be able to have somebody share some of those resources you mentioned. And I guess I also wanted to ask Rob and Sohaila, since you have some more experience in those educational settings in a more formalized sense, where do you think, you come in as individual educators in addressing those kinds of gaps in people's understanding of different groups?
I think it's a real challenge when you're looking at the public education system because it's so localized in a lot of different places. Here in Pennsylvania, for example, the state assembly is reluctant to kind of open up the public education curriculum because obviously we do have a lot of conservatism in certain parts of the state. Currently, we have a Republican majority in the state assembly who, might use that opportunity to put in other curriculum that is actually counterintuitive to some of the more progressive elements that we consider as just basic information about our communities. Ethnic studies is largely missing from public education. Even the city of Philadelphia, I think, although obviously has helped improve immensely over the last 3 or 4 decades, it's still very much individual teachers who make that decision of what kind of curriculum to include. So my solution to that as an educator is to try and engage my students at the college level with as much out of classroom learning as possible so that they can really see things for themselves, experience things for themselves. So even if they do have some preconceived notions that may be negative about a particular group of people, they can actually see from a firsthand experience that this is absolutely not the case. And I think the other part of that then is presenting public education in a public sphere through exhibits and other, I guess, non-traditional educational sources, which is one of the techniques that we continue to find success with.
Yeah. I'll add on to that. I've never worked in the public school system, so I've always been working either at the university level or in informal learning environments like museums. And so I think you're right, sort of like where else is education happening and where else do people learn other than just in the classroom? Because we see there are so many things broken with that. So, how can we build off of what students are learning in their classroom, but also then expand upon that? And for me personally, as an educator, one of the tools I use, and like I said, we use at JANM, is storytelling. And one of the things that I talk with our students about, we talk about lived experiences and we often ask them to share about their lived experiences. And so we do the same. We model those same things. And so I'm working with students and I'll tell them, oh yeah, this happened when 9/11 happened when I was in 8th grade and I was wearing hijab at the time and people would yell at me and say things to me on the street. Or, yes, I'm an Iranian American woman. My father is an immigrant from Iran. And as someone who doesn't look like that up front, I think even just talking to them about like my identities, I can see it breaks in students' heads, like, oh, that's not what I thought a Muslim looked like. Oh, that's not what I thought. That's not what I thought like a Japanese American looked like, or something like that. You know what I mean? So even just using like our own identities to sort of break stereotypes. And at first I was definitely like hesitant to like talk about those sorts of things. Just being like, it's not like the Sohelo show, right? Like, who cares about me? But I have had students then students I don't think would have come up to me before, they're like, oh, thank you so much for sharing that, like my family is also in Iran right now. Or so I think it's helping, like our personal identities can help bridge those gaps as well.
Thank you so much, Rob and Sohelo, both of you for sharing. And I think, the classroom, like I always think about the classroom, and like when I think about my experiences as a kid growing up, and kind of how the university system can perpetuate some things and also help to deconstruct others. So I think all those experiences you talked about are super important, and I hope that really spoke to some of our audience members here. I have another interesting question with regard to culture that Hyung-Tae has asked, so I'll just read what they said. Lisa Lowe contends, quote unquote, where the political terrain can neither resolve nor repress inequality, it erupts in culture. Because culture is the contemporary repository of memory, of history, it is through culture rather than government that alternative forms of subjectivity, collectivity, and public life are imagined. Through the, end quote, through the radiant historical excavation of Elaine Kim and Fresh Talks, Daring Gazes, we saw this sort of cultural eruptions within the creative output of the Japanese internment community as captives took to the world of aesthetics to articulate the inarticulable. Sorry, I lost my place. To the panelists, have you seen this sort of aesthetic polemical project taken on by the Muslim community following 9/11? I would love to expose myself to a broader creative tradition.
Yeah, so one of our programs that we offer each year is something called the Solidarity Arts Fellowship. And it's actually a program where we take a certain number, it's usually 8 Japanese American youth, and then 8 Muslim American youth, and then they collaborate together. So I think with what Suhaila was talking about in terms of windows and mirrors, it's like this kind of opportunity for a lot of folks to learn about each other's narratives and then actually go through this process that I think we've all kind of been talking about how can these 2 different catalysts be teaching moments for communities to learn more about solidarity. But we focus it on arts and healing. So there are different artists from the JA community and from the Muslim American community who come in and facilitate workshops with these youth for 6 months, usually a little bit longer sometimes. Like this year we did it online, which was a bit challenging, but we made it work. And through that process, these youth get to usually, like the outward goal is first and foremost learning about each other. But a lot of times in the closing interviews, you'll have these fellows talk about how they got to learn a lot about their own culture in a certain way, right? So if we're thinking about people who grow up, I think even Muhammad, with what you were talking about with your own experiences in school and how that impacted how you experienced your own, right, your own culture, your own religion, even outside of that, like I think a lot of youth have these experiences. So it's really about empowering youth to be able to see themselves in the way that they want to, whether it's unlearning Islamophobia, unlearning internalized homophobia, unlearning these things, or just amplifying their own voice that they already know exists through cultural and artistic production and through this like healing justice lens. And through that, there's also a lot of folks who are engaged in artistic production in the Muslim community who really, really work to support and collaborate. Because there is this really blossoming world that I think that's been emerging, especially in a post 9/11 context in the Muslim arts community.
Thanks, Yasmin. Rob, is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I can just jump in briefly. I think in addition to the project that was just mentioned, the Center for Asian American Media did I think it was a 3 or 4 year project called the Muslim Youth Voices, which featured media making with middle school to high school aged Muslim American youth. And it was an opportunity to kind of work collaboratively with professional filmmakers to put their own perspectives into the stories. So we actually were able to collaborate in Philadelphia as a partner of the Center for Asian American Media when the Muslim Youth Voices project happened here in 2016, which also actually coincided with one of the exhibits that JACL was hosting at the time. It was called I Bear Witness, and the prompt was basically to a set of contemporary Muslim American artists envisioning what the Japanese American experience was like during World War II with respect to their own experiences as Muslim Americans. And so the 7 artists created new original works, which were featured at the Asian Arts Initiative. It was curated by Atif Sheikh, who's one of the curators at 12 Gates Arts, an incredible South Asian Muslim-owned art gallery here in Philadelphia. So, there's just so much good work out there. And I think even from these kinds of collaborations, we've seen such incredible creativity that I think has the potential to reach people in ways that even the education can't.
Thanks for that insight, Rob. So our next question is from Imrul, who asks, what are some examples of cross-racial solidarities and organizing in response to Order 9066 and 9/11? In the spirit of Yuri Kochiyama, what lessons can we apply to our current political moment?
I can respond very quickly regarding the Philadelphia community actually helped to organize a safe passage for many Japanese American college students and their parents during the incarceration of World War II. It was the Quakers who started securing spaces within Bryn Mawr and Swarthmore College, really as just a symbol of kind of solidarity and acknowledging how terribly wrong it was for this to be happening. They were joined by other interfaith organizations like the Presbyterians as well. I always like to include that because it is actually the reason why we had so many Japanese Americans who settled here in Philadelphia during and after World War II.
Thank you, Rob. Yasmin, you can go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to also add that historically, I think there were a lot of collaborations between different radical groups that were organizing in the US in the 60s and 70s. And I think those lineages also continued on into today. So thinking about, for example, the Nation of Islam and its relationship to the community here in Los Angeles, and about different Black Muslim organizers currently working for Movement for Black Lives, but also to fight Islamophobia and anti-war. And then, I mean, I know that folks are familiar with the collaborations between the Japanese American community and the Muslim community because we're talking about Akira's film and things like that. But I just also really wanted to uplift that we're focusing a lot on the domestic because I think all of us live here, but these connections do really transcend the US borders. So we have a lot of collaborations on a transnational level with Muslim organizers in the UK and with a lot of folks fighting surveillance in different countries, which I think is also really important, especially in the 21st century to think about.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. So for the next set of questions, I think some of the audience members are more interested in the interactions between different racial groups within the US with regard to this issue. So let's see. So Randy and Lorraine are asking if you could put the level of Asian discrimination in the US in perspective relative to the discrimination faced by Black Americans.
And I would also argue.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just saying, I would also argue sort of like, what is the purpose of comparing to begin with? I don't think that it's a very productive discussion. I know we were talking about like drawing parallels between past and present, but I think we're talking more in terms of like how we can form a more just future and less about how we can compare the experiences of different groups or different individuals.
Right. I think this is one of those questions that's really, really important to talk about because it can be really easy to turn this into a, who's suffering more and who's suffering less kind of deal. But in reality, suffering is not monolithic in any way, and different groups face different degrees of oppression in very different ways. So I think that's a perspective that a lot of us kind of struggle with in understanding, especially within our community from the Asian continent and the diaspora, where we kind of fit into the historical narratives in the US and the narratives of other discriminated groups in our country. So I think like that kind of perspective that you both mentioned is really important in that, there's not really as much utility in comparison as it may seem, and that it can actually be harmful. So that said, there's another question here that's asking, are there organizations focused on building relationships between various Asian American activist groups so that we can work together to educate people about the common racism we are experiencing in our community? We could all be stronger if Black people and different Asian Americans, Muslims, etc., could all bond for a common cause. So I guess this person's asking if you have any suggestions about the coalition building between different activist groups.
I think that something that's really important with coalition building is really working hard to, when there are overlaps in work, centering that. I think sometimes, especially in the United States context, there are a lot of organizations that do really, really great work, but sometimes aren't in communication with each other. So you have work that's happening that could be amplified if it's happening in partnership. So I think even though it sounds really simple, something that's actually really helpful, and even I do personally in my own organizing is, when I'm organizing with a specific organization, is you look up the other organizations who are organizing around similar issues and see, are there political value alignments? Is there a reason that this partnerships shouldn't exist. Should my organization not collaborate with this person or this organization, or can we build bonds? And I think those things are really important. And the other thing, just for coalition across like racial groups or across ethno-religious groups, is also, I think, a really like a basic question that a lot of times I've seen organizers use is trying to think about who's most impacted or most marginalized by the work that we are centering. So for example, if we take Islamophobia, how do we think about who's not at the table and why? And how do we make sure that we can base build with those people and uplift those voices? So I think just that diligence and that self-discipline and that responsibility for other people beyond yourself, beyond your organization, is really important in building meaningful partnership.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Is there anybody else who wanted to mention anything?
Yeah, I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that, you know, it's not like there's such a thing as an Asian American issue, right? So it's like, I find that organizing in Asian American spaces is mainly done along issue area. So it's not just that, oh, well, you know, we're all impacted by this history of immigration legislation, et cetera. It's more that I see some similarity in the issue that is being faced by this community, and like that's why I'm getting involved in it. That being said, there are some Pan-Asian American groups here in Philadelphia. Asian Americans United is a really terrific example that does cross-community organizing. The Governor's Commission on Asian American Affairs has also done a lot of great coalition building work, not just with Asian American communities, but also with African American and Latinx communities that have their own commissions. And I guess like in a different way of looking at that same question, you know, the Japanese American community in Philadelphia mainly, aside from Islamophobia, is involved in the fight to end immigrant detention. And while there are some Asian American individuals that are part of that work, it's largely Latinx community groups and more recently the Haitian American immigrants who are currently being detained at the Berks Detention Center. There's many great ways to go about organizing, but coalition building doesn't necessarily start and end with our own ethnic or racial communities.
That's very important to keep in mind. Thank you so much, Rob. So I think I'm seeing a couple of questions on the idea of whiteness. I think somebody asked if we could talk a little bit more about the construction of whiteness. Yeah, I see it right here. Okay, so perhaps somebody can discuss the construction of whiteness. This informs the discussion of comparing and understanding the experience of non-white people in America. And there's also another question from Phil, who's asking, do you think the kind of rhetoric that we're talking about will alarm white Americans and make them feel threatened? So I guess you can kind of take those two fronts and kind of go in whatever direction you'd like. I think both of these questions kind of go along the vein of asking where white people come into the mix here and what we do in case white Americans feel threatened. But it's up to the panelists. You can kind of take it whatever direction you'd like.
My initial thought in my head, like lightheartedly, was if like they feel threatened, then there's something good that's happening. But I think the real part of that is if there's an uncomfortability that comes from discussing racism, from discussing violence, then I think that's really important to sit with on an individual level. I think that there's a lot of times where in conversations around political violence, people have their own guilt or their own comfortability that they don't know how to negotiate. And I think that's when you'll see defensiveness in conversations. I also think distinguishing whiteness, like white supremacy as an institution and as a violence from white people is really important. I think it's really, really important in getting to have honest conversations because there is a specific role that I think community members and allies can play for each other. So if we're thinking of people who identify as white as an ally to people who've experienced racism, then there is a specific role and responsibility that community has in calling out racism when they see it, and in also joining the fight against racism, right? Racism is not only an issue that affects communities of color or Black communities. So I think on the one hand, on an individual level, really sitting with, if you feel uncomfortable as a white person with hearing conversations around racism, around violence, around Islamophobia, why do you feel uncomfortable? What privileges do you have that feel threatened? What about your experience makes you feel threatened? And thinking that it's also your own responsibility to engage with other people in undoing that, right? But secondly, more importantly, recognizing that there's a really big difference between when we're talking about white supremacy and whiteness on this level that's structural versus individual white people. And I think that's important to understand so that way people can figure out what their role in fighting racism is.
Thanks, Yazan. Yeah, I think that distinction that you bring up is really important because it can be pretty easy to kind of forget that our understanding of these ideas like race and like white supremacy, they're all ultimately socially constructed. They don't come naturally with just being born into the world. So I think we have time for one last question. I'm sorry if there's background noise from here. I think somebody's driving an ATV in the background. So one last question that I think I'd like to just throw out there for the panelists. In what are some specific actions that we as individuals can take, especially in the current moment with the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement? How can we individually get more involved, support these organizations that have been mentioned, and just kind of go from there in helping to alleviate so many of the hate that is faced by all of our different communities?
I'll start just because I also think this connects with the last question. I think one of the first steps in any sort of justice-based work is self-interrogation and self-reflection. And so I think a lot of this work is a process of unlearning. And so I think one of the most critical places to start is in interrogating the self and interrogating what your biases are, like how you understand your lived experiences, what places do you hold power and privilege, what aspects of your identity have been marginalized and don't hold power. So I think starting with self-reflection is that a starting place? But you need to do that work and you need to interrogate the self before you can meaningfully work towards social justice.
Right, absolutely. I think part of what is going to help us move forward is people being more comfortable with being uncomfortable, and looking inwards and really facing those things that have been swept aside and swept under the rug for so long. So thank you so much, Sohaila. Thank you to the audience members who have asked all those wonderful questions. And thank you to all of our panelists. That concludes the Q&A portion of this program. So as a closing activity, I kind of just want to go around to the 4 different panelists and ask each of you, what is one takeaway that you've had from today's discussion?
Well, I'll start. I just want to say that my big takeaway, because I'm often sort of neck deep in different projects and not always involved in community activities and grassroots activities. I'm just really heartened to know that the sort of grassroots political activism solidarity is alive and well. And I'm really happy to see young people, out there engaging and doing their best to, make changes. And I'm just really happy about this panel and the fact that you guys have pulled this all together.
Thank you, Akira.
Anybody else want to talk about takeaway from today's conversation?
I really appreciated what Sohaila referenced from the youth that you were working with, who were talking about the importance in being able to identify when history repeats itself and that it's inevitable. I think that getting to have these kinds of conversations with youth and thinking about like strategy and movement building is really exciting and important work. And I think specifically that reflection just kind of sent me down my own rabbit hole of thoughts around why we do this work, and maybe really being more clear on what we're working for, I guess.
Thank you, Yasin. Sohaila, did you want to add something?
Yeah, thanks, Yasin. And I will say that I think one of the things I've learned from this panel is, that I know, but I think this is like a good example of it, is that there are people all over this country doing really great work. And sort of like you said, then sort of like researching the people that are doing the work, because there are a lot of people doing stuff out there that you might not be aware of. And so like I didn't even know there was a JACL chapter in Philadelphia. So, and I'm from Pennsylvania. So it's really heartening to see that there's so much great work happening.
I was, very pleased with the engagement that we were able to have between the panelists, but also specifically I wanted to highlight how impressed I was with the engagement from the audience as well. And I think a lot of the folks asking questions tonight are Penn folks, and it's exciting to see this level of discourse around, I think, critical race issues in this moment. So it's encouraging, and I think that this is a moment where, as an institution, but more importantly as a city and as a community, that we have an opportunity to continue these conversations for now in an online space, but hopefully when it's safe to do so in person, we'll be able to resume these kinds of conversations face to face.
Thank you all for sharing. Yeah, and I echo a lot of what you all took away from this as well. I think what really spoke to me is a lot of the comments on intersectionality, on our different identities, on how discrimination doesn't just function in one way. It functions in all kinds of ways that we're still trying to understand, and that these different communities aren't mutually exclusive. It doesn't mean, there's not a separate Muslim community, and there's not a separate Black community, there's not a separate Asian American community. There's a lot of overlap in those different experiences. And so when we talk about activism, when we talk about building narratives that actually reflect the experiences of people, I think those things are so important and so salient in where we want to move forward. So I really thank you all for your insight, for your comments, for your engagement with the issues just outside of this program, and also taking the time out to talk with me and all of our wonderful audience members. Before I kind of wrap this up, I wanted to point out that so our task force program series will be occurring over the foreseeable future. So hopefully somebody can drop in the link to the website where you can go check out that website. And we always encourage you to sign up for future installments of this series, future discussions, panels. Right now, we're going along this idea that's reflected in the title of our series, Stopping the Hate and Starting to Heal, living with and through the COVID-19 pandemic. So while a lot of this might seem like it's concentrated to this historical moment, it's always important to remember that these things are constantly happening, and we all have a job in addressing them. So thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you so much to everybody that's helped put this together. Thank you to the audience. I hope everybody took something away from this, and I hope to see everyone stay involved and contribute to a world full of less hate. Thank you so much.